Well, hello and welcome today. I'd extend a warm welcome to all of you joining us today for what is a little bittersweet, the last webinar of our Semester 2 Insight AppSad webinar series. It's a little disappointing that we won't have one next week, but it is nice to be moving into the festive season. And on that note, we're really excited to finish with an exploration of how alcohol is portrayed across different social media platforms. Before we begin, I'd like to, on behalf of Insight, acknowledge that the traditional custodians and owners throughout Australia, their continuing connection to the land and water, culture and community, it is their knowledge and teachings that we try to honour in the work that we do here. We'd pay our respect to elders past and present from the Turrbal and Yagara countries that we work from, and also extend that to those across the lands that you might be tuning in from today. Today's presentation will go through the Q&A will be open. If you could just post your questions in the Q&A, and when we get towards the end, we're hoping we might have a bit of time and that we'll be able to get to some of those, and I'll collate those and put those to our learned presenter today, Dr. Benjamin Riordan, a research fellow with the Centre for Alcohol Policy and Research at Trobe University, a well-published scholar with a range of research projects across psychology, alcohol use, media, and emerging technologies. He's here today to present Life Imitating Art, or Art Imitating Life. How is substance use portrayed in digital media, and what impacts can it have? And on that note, Ben, thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Brett. So I've stitched you up a little bit and have opted for a last-minute change of title. This one's a little less intense. The quote now is, "You didn't need to play it backwards." And I really want to start with this quote because it's a quote from an Australian guitarist from the band AC/DC, Angus Young. And some of you who are AC/DC fans may not be familiar with this quote, right? It's not in any of the songs. And it isn't. This isn't a lyric. This is actually a response Angus Young had to a situation. And the story behind this, I think, is really, really fascinating. So in the 80s, people were genuinely concerned about the impact that certain types of music were having on young people, arguing that certain types of music seemed to be causing delinquency, alcohol use, drug use, and risky sexual behavior. And some people were particularly worried that this behavior was being caused by backwards satanic messages that were being hidden in music that you couldn't hear when you played the record forwards, but when you played it backwards, you could hear that satanic reference. And the concern was that there was this thing that was affecting the health and behavior of young people without them even realizing it was there, right? And that sounds terrifying. You don't know this is here, but it is, and it's changing how you behave and the decisions you make. So songs like Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven, which is argued to be one of the greatest rock songs ever, supposedly has one of these hidden satanic messages. So if you fast forward the song to the lyrics where it says, if there's a bustle in your hedgerow, don't be alarmed now, etc., playing that bit backwards supposedly reveals this message. "Here's to my sweet Satan, the one whose little path would make me sad, whose power is Satan. He will give you 666. There was a little tool shed where he made us suffer. Sad Satan," right? So terrifying and super weird. And I would say, if there was a critique of this, it's that this is not a very good backwards satanic message. It's a little bit strange, but weird that that's there, right? And people were terrified of this. This thing could be affecting health and behavior, some people thought, right? And so fears escalated to the point where in the US there were Senate hearings, certain groups held record burnings. There were court cases against bands like Judas Priest, who supposedly had these messages, and families of victims argued that it had impacted their kids to do things they wouldn't have otherwise done. California even introduced a bill to mandate putting labels on these records, suggesting that this label should say, "Warning, this record contains backwards masking, which may be perceptible at the subliminal level when records are played backwards." Now, this bill didn't pass, but it did highlight that there was some serious fears around this time. Now, this kind of fizzled out, it turned out that these backwards satanic messages were really hard to actually hear. Um, like if you play Led Zeppelin backwards, you probably don't hear it unless you have those words up with you and your brain kind of fills in some of the gaps. And so it fizzled out. We moved on to other things like violent video games and concerns about other violent media. My favorite quote in response to being accused of having backwards messaging, though, came from Angus Young, where he said, "You didn't need to play the album backwards. We called the album Highway to Hell." And I think I agree with Angus Young's sentiment here because it's unlikely that these backwards messages can impact health, right? But I do believe that these forward messages might, and there is some evidence of this. And for unhealthy commodities like alcohol, which is often so normal and considered just a regular part of life, it can hide in plain sight, right? You don't have to hide it backwards. You can just mention it. But I think the key bit is like, why does this matter? Like, what impact might exposure actually have on health? And what should we do? Like, should record burnings be back on the cards? Or is this just something we live with now? And so the so what of this is like, there's a lot of evidence that has suggested there's a link between exposure to alcohol in different types of media and alcohol use. In the context of, say, advertising, some people have suggested that it is causal, right? Like it is directly causing subsequent alcohol use for youth who are exposed to ads. There's a lot of evidence with social media, some with television and films, as well as music, that exposure to alcohol in those medias can lead to alcohol use. And often, at least for alcohol use, the two most popular mechanisms to explain this link are social cognitive theory or social learning theory and social norms theory. So this suggests that exposure or seeing lots of alcohol in media leads to the idea or belief that alcohol is normal and everyone's doing it and people approve of this, which then in turn predicts alcohol use. In terms of social cognitive theory, the idea is you see a lot of references to alcohol, particularly positive references, and you believe that alcohol is associated with these positive outcomes, which then again, in turn, predicts your alcohol use. So why do I care about this if there's this established effect? Well, it's because how much our media has changed, right? So I've become super interested in this because with the advent of, say, smartphones and with streaming platforms, it's changed how we consume media. So music is not like a new technology, right? Music has been around for ages. But now with platforms like Spotify, and with our mobile phones and with headphones being as good as they are, we can access this all the time. And we can access more diverse music than ever before, right? I think I saw a stat the other day that was there is more music released daily in 2024 than all of 1989. So there's more music for us to access than ever before, which is exciting and fun, and we never have to be without it. And with films, like that, maybe our viewing and how much we're engaging with film media hasn't changed that much. So it's estimated we're at 17 hours per week. Platforms like Netflix means that we can watch whenever we want or whatever we want. It's on demand and our access has changed. And social media obviously has kind of come out of nowhere. And now we're dropping like 17 hours per week on social media. So that's a lot of time that we are spending engaging in different types of digital media, which I think is super fascinating and why it's probably more important than ever before to understand, like, what is the impact of, say, exposure to alcohol-related content in some of these things. And so I run one of Caper's research streams that focuses on alcohol, media, and emerging technology. And I'm going to structure this talk around our three aims of this research stream. The first being, how is alcohol and other drugs, how are they depicted in the media? So how common is it? Like, how often do we see references to alcohol? What does it look like when we do see it, right? Is it positive? Is it negative? And then finally, like, how are policies and alcohol-related phenomenon discussed online? And what learnings might we take from, say, collecting tweets about alcohol, etc.? The next is, what is the actual impact of this, right? Like, if you see more alcohol-related content, does it matter? Like, how much of an impact is it having? And importantly, like, is it large enough for us to care? What are the mechanisms explaining that link, right? Is it that social norms or social cognitive theory, or is something else going on here? And then finally, like, who is most impacted? Is it teens who are using it, or is it older adults? Like, who's the group we should most be concerned about when they're experienced, or coming up against alcohol in the media. And then finally, like, what should we do? What are our intervention targets? What policies should we introduce, and who should be targeted? And so I'm gonna structure this talk around these 3 points today. How common is alcohol in the media? What is the impact, and what should we be doing about it? So first, like, starting with alcohol in the media, we do a lot of research on a lot of different types of media. But I want to start by talking about music, because we're off to a good start by starting with the Satanic Panic. And so my team and I wanted to first look at how common is alcohol in music, right? Given that we are dropping like 17 or 21 hours per week on music and probably listening to more music than ever before. And so we started with a systematic review and meta-analysis. So my PhD student, Jennifer Allen, ran a systematic review and identified as many papers as he could that had looked at how common alcohol references were in the media. So finding these content analysis where the researchers had collected, say, 1,000 songs, read through each of the lyrics of the songs, and estimated what proportion of these songs may have alcohol. Overall, he found 23 papers that addressed this, and 12,000 plus songs had been analyzed. So I want to start with some audience participation here, because I'm a bit of a monster like that. So if you guys could use the chat, what percentage of songs do you think include a reference to alcohol? I've added some multi-choice response options down below, but it's best if you ignore those and just like go with vibes and put in a number. Like, what do you expect? Okay, I'm going to give you a couple of seconds. I can see there are some responses. If you feel too nervous about writing it in the chat, just like feel the answer in your heart or think it in your head or throw it out into the world in the form of good vibes. All right, so we found 22% of those songs estimated to include at least one reference to alcohol in the lyrics, right? So that's around over 1/5 of songs. In terms of this, we also found a lot of music videos. 1/4 of music videos show alcohol. Like, there's a depiction of alcohol, and alcohol is seen in these music videos, which is super fascinating, right? And then finally, like, if you were to have like both the lyrics and the music video, it was nearly 1/3 of them. So alcohol is referenced quite a bit in these. And so overall, any reference, we're sitting at 1/4. So this is pretty high, right? Way higher than I had initially expected. I should also note, I really misled you guys with some of those multi-choice options. But it's just because going into this project, that's where I would have thought that it landed. Instead, we're sitting at that 22%, which is high. So I'm coming back to this quote by Angus Young here, like, you didn't need to play it backwards, right? Like, alcohol can in some ways hide in plain sight. Like, it is so common, and we often, I think, don't necessarily realize it was there. This paper got us really fascinated. They're like, why is alcohol so common, and what might predict these references? And we found that, like, when we take into account so many different factors of the songs, one of the largest predictors of it is time, right? So this is some data from that systematic review, where we found like what years the songs had been released and sort of plotted them, finding that in the 1960s right up to the early 1980s, we don't see a lot of alcohol-related references in songs. So, around that sort of under 10% of songs reference alcohol. Right up to 2020, where we're seeing closer to 30%, and there's even one up there that's close to 40%. Now, one limitation with this is the 23 studies were very diverse, right? So some looked at pop music over a long period of time. Some focused specifically on rap or pop. And part of the reason this may be misleading is like, well, if you focus just on rap says more words, and so you're more likely to have an alcohol reference. So this is maybe not a good indication of this, but still, like, it looks like there's an increase. And so we wanted to replicate this, right? Like, how do we best show that there's a trend over time? And so rather than doing that meta-analysis, we also identified every song in Billboard's Top 100 from 1959 to 2020, right? So Billboard is a US chart that keeps a top 100, and it was the longest running one that was the most referenced that we could find. And we unfortunately hand-coded all of the lyrics in this, so it's over 6,000 songs, and my poor PhD student, Dan Anderson-Luxford, thanks Dan, and I read through every single one of these and hand-coded whether alcohol was present or not. And then we also could use Spotify's API to get more information about the song, right? Like how long is the song? Because we wanted to say like not only like what's the proportion of song, but how often do you hear alcohol like per hour? And so we wanted to be able to estimate that. Like if you were to listen to an hour of music, how many references would you hear? And so we largely replicated our finding by using this method where we used data from just one source. And so again, we found that there's a solid increase in the amount of alcohol references. And there's a lot of variation around that line when we reach the sort of later 2000s. But still, like that's up enough for 30% of songs now in the charts are referencing alcohol. And some of you may think like, well, people don't really listen to just the top 100. And that's true. But the group that is listening to that top 100 the most are young people who are starting to develop their ideas around what alcohol is and what life is, right? More concerning when you consider that most of these are positive, right? Like the vast majority of these references to alcohol are positive and make alcohol look good. When we look at like, okay, what about when we account for time or how often alcohol is referenced in a song? And so when we look at the duration of a song and how many alcohol references are made in that song, and we look at, say, the top 100, we estimate that it's around 15 references per hour. So if you were to sit down and listen to the top 100 from, say, 2020, you'd hear around, say, 12 to 15 references about alcohol per hour, which is really high. And this has changed a little bit more. So as you can see, like it's coming down a bit, but this is largely because rap music was sort of dominating the charts in those like around the 2010, and that's come down a bit now with more pop focus with fewer words. And what we did to account for that as well is we ran a regression and took into account like the wordiness or speechiness and instrumentalness of a song. And the duration, still finding that like the best predictor of whether a song includes alcohol or not, or how many references to alcohol there were, is time, right? Like it's just increased over time. Now, the other thing that is probably impacting and driving this effect is the type of music that is in that top 100. Because this is a little bit of an issue, right? And a limitation with this study is when we look at, say, what different types of music include alcohol references, rap and pop seem to be dominating this, right? Like 43% of rap songs, 30% of pop. In contrast, like only 16% of rock songs, despite our like sex, drugs, and rock and roll and like concern around rock music, it appears actually has fewer references. Now, the reason why this alone may not be that interesting is because of when these genres are most popular on the charts. It's like rap has been more recently dominating the charts, similar to pop. Again, like rap says more words. So still, like there are genre-specific effects, but time still appears to be a really good predictor of whether alcohol is in a song or not, and it's increased. Additionally, like rap and pop, at least in modern music, tend to be focused around like the party bangers and celebrations and having a good time and going out. And so that may be why those genres tend to reference alcohol more. The other reason people have suggested is like, what about brands, right? And from Getter's systematic review, we found like 5% of songs reference brands. And it's hard to know whether there's sponsorship here and whether that's increasing. And that's definitely something that we intend to look at in the future. But there are quotes like this that would make us suggest think like, hey, there is sponsorship of artists to include alcohol references. For example, this is a quote from a Petey Pablo song. "Now I gotta shout out Seagram's Gin because I drink it and they pay me for it." There's a clear acknowledgement of our sponsorship in there. So our next step for this work is to really look at those changes of time for brands as well. Like, are we seeing more brand references in music? The other thing, as I mentioned, is it's very positive. Like references to alcohol appear predominantly positive. This is a figure from a Taylor Swift paper we're working on, where we wanted to look at Taylor because often like we consider that when a popular person is really famous and awesome, it can have a stronger effect on like, you know, how awesome you think alcohol looks or your norms, right? Because you admire that person, you want to be like them. And so seeing them drinking alcohol, particularly it leading to good things, can have an impact on how you view alcohol. So we analyzed every Taylor Swift video to look at Taylor's emotional state when she was drinking or when she held a drink. And those numbers on that figure are in seconds, and the amount of space each of them take up is the proportion of time which she was spent in each emotional state. So we found like the vast majority of the time where Taylor Swift is shown with alcohol in her music videos, she's in a positive mental state, right? Like it's happy and it's positive and it's pro-sex and pro-wealth and pro-celebration. Even when she's sad though, like those 80 seconds of her being sad shown with alcohol's often seen as a way to help cope with those problems. So even that's not necessarily negative, right? It's shown that alcohol can help you deal with some of the harms of life and get you through periods of time. So this music stuff has been fascinating. We're still doing some research in the area, but I want to pivot now then to social media, right? And switch gears just a little bit, because social media is so hot right now in Australia in particular, with a social media ban on the horizon. And I want to again pitch a question to you and think back to when you were, say, between the ages of 7 and 11, and think of how you would answer this question. Like, what do you want to be when you grow up? So having a think, what did you want to be when you were older? And a lot of young people were asked this, and like you tend to see similar-ish results, right? Like famous sports person, teacher, a vet, or a police officer who also happens to have a cute dog. Like that seems like a pretty good career. The interesting thing when I think 17,000 young people between the ages of 7 and 11 were asked this question, there was a surprising new addition to that top 5 or top 4, and it was from social media influencers, right? Which is super fascinating. And the authors of the study suggested that this probably suggests our media is changing, right? Like once upon a time, people wanted to be famous actors or actresses, but now with social media becoming such a more dominant force, being famous for being good at social media or an influencer is, now something to aspire to. So the reason we're talking about influencers is because I think musicians can also now be influencers, right? So this is our working definition of influencer. So they have established credibility in a specific industry. They have access to a huge audience and can persuade others to act based on their recommendations. So I think like in this day and age, like it's not just music that's important. It's the fact that young people may follow the musician on, say, Instagram. Like they now have, like, rather than just being famous for their music, they can be active on social media platforms and have a greater reach and can influence their audience more than ever before. So if we use this definition of an influencer, so rather than just someone who's good at Instagram, it's like, no, a musician is an influencer too if they have a large following and post a lot. And the reason I think this is important and why influencers in particular are important is because, as suggested by social cognitive theory, like when we see posts from people we admire, it can be more powerful. So going back to that Taylor Swift thing, if you're a huge Taylor Swift fan, you're scrolling through Instagram or TikTok or something, and you come across a post of her, drinking alcohol and looking like she's having a good time, that's way more influential on, say, how you view how cool alcohol is or the positive outcomes that alcohol can have. In contrast, if you come across an image of me like, well, I look extremely dapper and fly here, it's probably not going to have as big an impact on, say, how cool you think alcohol is. Maybe it has a little bit, and maybe exposure to a lot of this does, but that content from famous people can be particularly informative, especially for young people who put a lot of stock in and believe influencers are really important. So then with this question is like, how common is alcohol from social media influencers, right? Like how often are they posting about alcohol? And particularly how often are they posting about graphics? So there's a really cool study with Dutch young people where they asked them, hey, name the top 3 influencers you follow. This group then collected the top 100 posts from those influencers and analyzed all of them, so about 17,000 posts, and found that there were like 2.2% of these posts referenced alcohol. Now, that may sound like a small number, right? And if this were a music study, like we'd be like, that's great. The difference is a song is, say, like 3 minutes long, whereas a social media post is very short, and we're dropping an estimated 143 minutes per day on social media. If you're scrolling through social media, that's a lot of content you can consume. So that 2.2% number becomes pretty important, right? Like if you were to see alcohol for 2.2% of a movie, you would probably think like there's a weird amount of booze in this film. So although that sounds small, like we think that can be pretty large. Now, the study also found 100% of those posts were positive, right? So due to the nature of social media, particularly Instagram, when you post on these platforms, you're not posting about the harms and the difficulties. Like often it's showing this lifestyle and how cool and awesome you are, right? And unfortunately, that means when alcohol is posted, it's a part of that. A follow-up study, this Megan Strauger used a similar strategy where they asked young people who they followed, but then asked how often those influencers post about alcohol, and found a link between your own alcohol use and whether you're exposed to alcohol from influencers, right? So that's super fascinating. Like it could be having an impact on our health. One issue with some of these studies is content analyses are really hard and they take time, right? So that Dutch study, they limited it to 100 posts from the top influencers. And that's still a lot, but influencers post a lot on social media, right? So you're missing a lot if you just select the top 100. Also, they didn't have a large number of influencers. And this is, again, content analyses are hard. Dan and I started hand analyzing those 6,000 lyrics in 2020. It's 2024 and that paper is still not out. Like it takes a lot of time if you're going to do it on a large scale. So this is me with content analyses. Maybe we'll just do 1,000 posts because I'm sleepy. Now we're in a really cool age, which is another reason I'm so excited about media type analysis. It's because AI can do some of these things really efficiently and can be accurate, especially if it's a pretty simple thing like is alcohol here or not. And so here's my quote from AI. I assume it says, blink bloop, YOLO, which means you only live once. Let's analyze it all, right? So with AI, it doesn't need to sleep like we do. If the task is simple, it can be pretty accurate. And we can cut it loose to analyze, say, a really large amount of data. So we decided to do this with some of the top influencers in Australia. So we identified the top 1,034 Australians and collected every single post they'd ever written. So this was 688,000 posts, which is way too many for me to read through. And then we unleashed AI on these posts to estimate how common alcohol is in the text of the posts that they'd written. So this is a Vic Health funded project. We were looking how common is alcohol and how often are, say, brands referenced, and are we seeing declarations? Because when an influencer is sponsored by a company to post about alcohol, they're supposed to declare it, right? So that you know that you're looking at an ad. What we found was 3.4% of these posts referenced alcohol, which again is high when we consider how much time we're spending on social media. So 3.4% is high. We also this is probably an underestimation because we used a model that was more conservative. Like we didn't want to overestimate how much alcohol there was. So we chose a model that performed really well. It was like 98% effective or 90-something% effective. But it was more likely to it was less likely to have false positives, which is what we wanted. Like we're happy to underestimate this. We read through every single post that it said was alcohol related to double check that it didn't include those false positives because we wanted to be conservative. So it's likely higher than this number, but this is the bare minimum number it would be. Now, one concern is not just how common these were, but when we saw alcohol related posts, they had more upvotes and more likes than non-alcohol related posts. And you may think why does it matter if alcohol posts receive more upvotes and more comments? And the first reason is it provides approval and shows that, hey, people are supportive of, alcohol. It's like social learning. It's like, people seem to like that. I should imitate that behavior if I also want to be cool. The other reason it's important is Instagram and other platforms want to keep you on their platform, right? So they're more likely to feed you posts that are doing well. So posts that receive more engagement and more likes and more comments are more likely to be pushed and seen by others. So it's likely that alcohol-related posts not only are common, but they're more likely to be seen. Finally, when we look at the main bit, how often are sponsored posts written? From our alcohol posts, so we had 24,000, about 4,262, so 17% mentioned a brand in that text. And then 83% of those posts, that brand was the main focus. So this may be a really weird and confusing way to conceptualize this. Like, why did you do brand mention and brand focus? And the reason was it's really hard to make a judgment call on whether these are advertising or not, right? Like, we tried to have our AI model did it. It thought all of it was advertising because the posts look positive and awesome. So even the posts that don't mention brands look like advertising for alcohol because they look great. So we had to go through and be like, okay, which of these posts reference brands? And that was really common, but the brand focus was the weird bit. So a brand mention would just be like, this is an example. I went to the text of the post. So imagine this is a text of the post. I went to AppSad today. It was great. I gave my talk, and then I came home and had a Heineken. It was pretty good. What a great day. Heineken is mentioned there, like a brand was mentioned, but it wasn't necessarily the focus, right? Like the focus was on the presentation. Now, the example of a brand focus would be, I went to AppSad today and gave my Insight Symposium. It was great. I then came home and had a Heineken. My God, Heineken is delicious. It is the nectar of the gods. It makes my life better. My life is better because of Heineken. Hashtag buy Heineken, right? So that's not on the talk. Now there's a weird focus on the beverage. So like most of these posts that reference the brand had that focus. And so while we didn't make a judgment call on whether it's advertising or not, because we didn't have any ground truth, there was no way to tell, it does seem like we are seeing some sponsorship in there. And while a lot of these some of them do have a hashtag ad or some acknowledgement, a lot of them didn't, right? And again, we don't necessarily know that they weren't about alcohol. That person might have really liked Heineken, but it seemed suspicious. Now, one issue we have is like, okay, so we access this data as if we were under 18, right? So this was all posts that an under 18-year-old could see on Instagram. If we would even just say remove all the posts that referenced the brand or that were potentially sponsorship, we would still be left with a lot of posts that look really, really positive, and we and AI could not determine the difference between what a post about that was an ad and just a regular post was. And for example, let's do another fun experiment. Which of these posts is sponsored and which of them is not sponsored? So have a look through. 3 images, all of them alcohol is pretty present. Which of these do you think are sponsored posts and which of them do you think are not sponsored? I've done some tactical blurring as well. If anyone wants to use the chat, that's fine. If you're too embarrassed because I destroyed you last time with my misleading things, like totally look at there too. But do you think any of these are sponsored or none of them or one of them or which ones? All right, so the answer is actually these were none of them. These are all images of me because apparently I just like to do this. No, so this is some data from a tutorial paper we're writing at the moment where we want to include some data to teach people how to use machine learning. And it's easy to include images of me. Now, the point I've made, though, is like all of these posts can look like their sponsorship, and it's so hard for us to know. And when we consider the impact that exposure can have, if you were to even remove, say, all advertising, we're still going to see a lot of really positive alcohol-related posts, and that is likely impactful on how we drink and our beliefs around alcohol use. So, like, reducing advertising is still something we should do, and it's great, but even still, that we're left with things that make alcohol look really good. If you are interested in potentially running some of these models, as I mentioned, like we do have some tutorial papers we're working on. This is one that we use. Some of this data, it's just on text. And so if you're interested, have a crack at that or get in touch. Like I'm more than happy to talk about this because it's super interesting. Okay, so that's the first aim of this, right? How common is alcohol? And I think my argument is it's way more common than you'd think. We do a lot of other research on how alcohol is presented, like is it more positive, is it negative, what policies are discussed, like how do people feel about alcohol in sport on Twitter, how are people discussing alcohol during pregnancy, There's lots of stuff we do in this space, and I'm happy to provide information if people want to reach out. But there's not enough time, guys. So let's move on to the second aim. Like, what is the impact, and why should we care about how often you see alcohol in different types of media? And as I mentioned at the start, like, there's some good evidence that there's a link between the amount of alcohol we're exposed to and alcohol use. For example, this is just social media. Alabash ran a really cool systematic review and found 93% of the studies that had looked at this link found that there's a positive association, right? So the more you see alcohol, the more you use social media, the more alcohol you're likely to drink. So there's a link between these two variables. We've seen meta-analyses from Curtis and another Australian group led by Cheng et al. Also finding like there's a moderate link between these two variables. So that's super interesting, right? In terms of mechanisms, though, and how we understand this, very few of the studies we've found have considered this, right? Like, what might explain this? So when we look at a number of media effects theories that aim to explain the link between exposure and use, almost all of them suggest that there's an indirect effect, right? That it's not just, oh, if you see alcohol more, you're going to drink more. They suggest it's through another variable, like the social norms. It would be norms. Social cognitive theory, it would be like how cool and awesome you think alcohol looks, or alcohol expectancies, like if I drink, good things happen. So we systematically review this area to look at like, okay, what are the papers that have looked at understanding the mechanism? And we only found 10 that have really done it. And they were very much all over the place. The most common mediator, though, or mechanism, was social norms theory, which we found explained about 26% of this variance. So there's still a lot left in there. The reason why it's important to keep doing this work, and why we're pushing for like more work should be done to do this, is that it can really help us identify some targets for intervention, right? Should we be aiming to reduce just exposure, or is there something we can target that's a bit easier? Because reducing exposure is really, really hard and requires maybe policy change. But if we know the target of that mechanism, like norms, that can help us, inform our interventions, like what should we focus on, and how can we mitigate some of the harms if they're there. Now, this research is really interesting, and I love reading through, and it's awesome. One issue with it, though, is how we measure exposure, because measuring how often you see alcohol in media is really, really hard. So we're going to do another fun experiment, guys. It doesn't work as well when you're online, but I'm really pleased to see that there's a comment box and people seem to be using it. So as another fun experiment, I would like you to estimate how much alcohol is in each of these films, which are films that are really important for millennials, two of which are lovely and warm, and one of which has probably scarred our generation. And I will leave it to you to estimate which one was potentially scarring. But I want you to estimate how much alcohol was in each of these films. So in Alvin and the Chipmunks, which I watched with my daughter the other day, in Marley and Me, and then in Finding Nemo. So if you want to write in the chat, separated by a comma, like how often you thought alcohol was in each of these films, use your best guess. Like if you haven't seen them, it probably doesn't matter. You go off vibes or the poster. If you have seen them, then you should give a really good informed guess, right? Especially if you saw this last week, like I did with my daughter. All right. So I'm going to give you another couple of seconds because I'm too excited to reveal the results. Okay. Some stuff's coming in, which is great. All right. If you don't want to answer, that's all good. I understand that I'm just apparently using this platform to mislead and embarrass you. But here are the results. So Alvin and the Chipmunks, we're looking at 62, right? Alcohol was shown 62 times in this film. In Marley and Me, we're looking at 48. Again, that's a pretty high number and a weird amount of alcohol. Like Alvin and the Chipmunks was G, at least Marley and Me, I think, was PG. So like, okay, that's a bit better. And Finding Nemo, there was 0. This is a film about fish, and very, very few humans are depicted in this. I picked this one because I'm worried I've broken you and you were going to go for a high number. So anyway, the point is it's really hard to do this. Even if you have seen these films, or if you haven't, highly likely you were wrong. And I don't mean that to say like it's just you, like everyone is bad at this, because it's really hard to know. So the films I picked, maybe you haven't seen them, and so you could argue like, well, that's not very fair, and I totally get that. So when we ran this with participants, I think we had about 520 participants. We had a longer list of films, and we said pick up to 10 films that you know and remember best and that you watched recently. And so participants could go through and pick, 1 or 10 or etc. Like however many they felt that they really knew, and these were like banger films that were very, very popular. So we asked them, pick the film, and then afterwards we asked them, how long ago did you see it, and how often do you think alcohol is depicted in this? And on average, they thought like there were 9 alcohol depictions, which is a solid guess, right? Like it's not 0. Like, hey, you think alcohol's in here? That's pretty good. The actual value though was 5 times higher than they thought. It was around 45. And we then tried to like control for like, okay, well, maybe it's how long ago you saw it. So we controlled for that, finding like, not really, that doesn't have any impact at all. We accounted for whether it was G or PG. That did have an impact. Like people were better with G films, but it's because they often estimated 0 and there was less room for there to be a large difference. So people were not great at this. Now, again, another argument could be like, well, maybe they saw these films a really long time ago, and even though you controlled for that, that's still not very good. So we replicated this by then showing people, like we brought people in and said, like, watch this, watch it really closely. Highly likely we're going to try and trick you. And so they watched it. We compiled like, I think 6 ads together into a 5 to 10 minute video. We asked people to watch it and watch it very closely. And then at the end, asked them to report how much alcohol was in there. And they were still very wrong, right? Because it's hard to do. I think the true value was like 12 or 13, and people estimated that there were like 5 or 6. So that they were closer, but they still underestimated by quite a lot. And some of these, like alcohol was really obvious. Like at one point, someone is opening a beer in a propeller plane, like a small plane. It's like, whoa, is that the pilot? Like memorable stuff. So even still, like it's really, really hard to do this. And so the concern is with a lot of papers, when we ask people, and the most common way to measure social media exposure is how often do you see alcohol in social media? And my concern is we're very, very bad at that, right? So that is a concern going forward that this area needs to seriously consider, like, why are we still doing it like this? There must be a better way. Now, as another fun experiment, Australia is moving to ban social media use for those who are under the age of 16. A lot of that research is also based on self-report. So again, as an experiment, and we can go through this one a little quickly, if you estimate how much time you spent on social media yesterday and write down that value, you can then check how close you are because your phone is actually recording that data. So I've included some instructions on the screen for how you can access how much time you spend on different social media sites or different media sites if you're an Android or an iPhone user. And we don't have to go through this now. I'll leave those instructions up. But there is a true value here that we can get. And again, like a study by Parry et al. Suggested, we're very bad at this, right? Again, the concern is a lot of the evidence that's aimed to look at the impact of social media on alcohol use has used time from self-report, where we're very bad at estimating how much time we've spent on social media or how much time we've been exposed to alcohol. So a lot of this evidence we have to take, like, not necessarily throw it out, but consider like we're maybe not grasping the full picture here, and we might need to change some of our methods for how we look at these phenomena and how we study it. And the positive thing is, like, I don't want to just throw the whole area under the bus. Like, there's a lot of really cool research going on in this area now to rectify that. Like, now that we know this is an issue, we can do better things to test this, right? So for example, there are apps often installed on your phone that will measure how much time you spend on social media on your phones. A group at UQ led by Dan Angus has a really cool app where it's recording on your phone like how often you see alcohol advertising, which is just so cool. A group in the US to estimate alcohol film exposure. So rather than saying like how much alcohol did you see in films yesterday, instead asked young people a list of, say, I think it was 500 films. They said, which of these films did you see? They did content analyze those to estimate how often people had seen alcohol, right? So like or films that included a lot of alcohol, which is really cool. So rather than directly asking, you just ask people what films they watched, and then you estimate how much alcohol was in those films to see how much alcohol they were exposed to. And then finally, like some cool methods with social media is to use social media scroll throughs. So a number of groups are doing this. So, Catherine Beckholer at Deakin University and her team are asking participants to record their screen while they're on social media. And then they're analyzing that to get an objective measure of how often you're actually exposed to different advertising. A group at UQ, led by Rhys Rutherford, have been asking people to say scroll through and then take some screenshots of the ads they're seeing. So there are really cool methods being used in here that now with technology, like we can solve some of these issues and do a really good job of them. And so I think like more weight probably needs to be put on studies that have done this well, right? And that have really, really aimed to better understand how often we're exposed, or even like how much time we're spending on social media. Now, the other way we can do this, and I will say like there is still some great evidence out there, is using an experimental design, right? This is where we say randomize people into different media watching conditions or media use conditions. So this is one of my favorite studies that I was involved in this area, where Dr. Damien Scarf wanted to test the impact of the new Joker film on people's perceptions of those with mental illness. And so the concern is that Joker is a really, really popular, awesome film that's great and really has been well received. But it depicts like the main character, it depicts him, Arthur Dent, as having a mental illness and then like having issues with, say, his medication and some help, and then proceeding to go on a violent rampage, right? Like including murder. And so it depicts mental illness or someone experiencing it as violent and unpredictable, right? And so the concern is like, well, what impact does this have on people's perceptions of those with mental illness? And so Damien, while the movie was still being shown at the films, hired out the movie theater and then randomized participants into two different watching conditions. So either one film theater which showed the Joker film, or another that showed Terminated Judgment Day. I don't know which number it was, like 5 or 6. Which is like a bang bang shoot 'em up robot film, right? There's no depictions of mental illness in there. And what he did was he got people in, asked them to fill out a survey beforehand and answer the people with mental illness, prejudice towards people with mental illness scale, right? And it has items like, how much do you agree with the following? People with mental illness are dangerous, or you can never predict what someone with mental illness will do, or people with mental illness should be controlled and supervised, right? So like, I think 20 odd items similar to that, asking for your agreement. So he asked them to do that both before and after the film, and found that those who were in this Joker condition increased their prejudice towards those with mental illness afterwards. So super fascinating study, again, like showing like when we do this experimental design, like we can control for different things. And studies that do this are so cool. So another example from Damien's group is to test the impact of social media on mental health. He randomized people into different social media use conditions. So one group, he said, like, use social media as you normally do. Another group, he said, limit it to 20 minutes per day. He then followed those groups for 2 weeks and asked them daily to report their social media use using cell phone screenshots so he could actually see how often they were using social media. And they reported their well-being as well as their sleep, finding that there wasn't that much difference between those two conditions, right? And other experimental research in that area has found like there's some mixed findings. So experimental research is really cool. Like we can control for these things a little bit better to estimate the impact. So what is the impact? Like that's, I think, super fascinating area in terms of having some tech solutions to help us better understand this. What we're doing now is we have some ongoing studies to estimate this. We are getting things like those screenshots of daily social media use. We're asking people now, like, what influencers do you follow? And then rather than sort of asking people again, like, how much does that person post about alcohol? We're actually grabbing all of those social media influencers posts, right? To better look at that link between exposure and use from people they think are important. Additionally, like we're tracking people for 28 days and getting 2 times daily scroll throughs. So we can, rather than asking people how much did you see alcohol yesterday, we're getting them twice a day to scroll through to give a better estimate of how often or how much they might be seeing alcohol. And so there are lots of really cool solutions in this space that I'm excited about. Oh, we're also collecting people's Spotify libraries. So like your history of music listening and then what impact that might have on alcohol use. And so I'm so excited about some of the research in this area that has these novel solutions to measuring something that's really, really hard to measure. So it's not all doom and gloom. There's some great research out there, but some of it I think should be highlighted more maybe than others. All right. And then this is my final point, which I think is also really, really important, is what do we do with this, right? Like what can we actually do with this information? What should our intervention targets be doing, and what should our policy targets be? And I'm going to kind of split this up into intervention and policy. And the first paper that I'm excited to share you guys is I think like the most obvious. It's like, well, what if we just tell people how common it is? And our thoughts were the same, right? Like, I'm surprised by how often alcohol is in media and films and music. And I study it, like, it's still like confronting to see. And so our thought was, well, if we inform people, maybe they will be more supportive of certain policies that could be really helpful. So in that study where we asked people their top 10 films and then asked them to estimate how much alcohol they were exposed to, we then randomized people into two conditions, and one received some feedback, or by feedback, they received some information about how often alcohol is actually in films. So, we report like in Alvin and the Chipmunks, it's shown 62 times, and that's a film aimed at kids. In Marley and Me, it's 48. We then included some information about, the link between exposure and use and how harmful alcohol can be. We then asked people, so in the other condition, they just clicked on through. They didn't get that feedback. And we then had 8 policy statements that we asked people to rank after this, right? So like about alcohol in films, like, how much do you support the following? Like the amount of alcohol shown should be included in the classification system, which it currently isn't really. How much do you agree that films should not that include alcohol should not be shown to those under 15, or that alcohol shouldn't be glorified? And overall, we didn't find any real big difference between the two conditions, the group who received some information about how common alcohol was versus the other group. There was one item where the two differed. So those who received the feedback were more in agreement that information about alcohol sponsorship should not be provided. So there was one win in there. Now, one of the limitations with the study was we didn't provide tailored feedback. So we really had wanted to do this, but we broke the survey platform that we were trying to use by trying to offer that tailored feedback. So, where we would give you feedback on the films you selected. And so we only had static feedback. So like that's something we can take on board and be like, okay, in the future, if we provide people really tailored feedback about the films that they said they're watching, like, is this more impactful? The other reason this may not have worked very well is that overall people were actually really supportive of like implementing more restrictive policies for films. So for example, this item, alcohol beverages should and consumption should not be shown in G or PG films. So those are films often aimed at kids. G is for general audiences. PG is for parental guidance is recommended. Most people sat between this, like agree and strongly agree. So they were supportive of these policies, like regardless of which of the conditions they were in. So it is positive and means like maybe there is some work we can be doing in this space to push for alcohol to be better included in the classification, because it seems like there's a weird amount of alcohol in some films, and maybe that should be taken into account. And so like in my mind, this is probably how the classifications should look, right? Where in G films, like, hey, maybe don't include alcohol. PG films, it's maybe okay to have a little. And M films, so for mature audiences, like, yeah, probably alcohol, it's more fine there. And then for R films, it's restricted anyway. And so, yeah, you expect there to be something that maybe kids shouldn't see in that. And so I feel like our system should look like this. And again, maybe alcohol should be part of the classification system, because at the moment it's just included under other themes or potentially drug use. But alcohol specifically is not listed there. And in the US, running some analysis, this is how this looks, right? So G-rated films, some of them have a little bit, but the vast majority of them have no alcohol. PG films do still have quite a bit of alcohol. Like most of the PG films have alcohol, at least one reference to alcohol in them. Um, but still not many. I guess 26 is still pretty high. And then PG-13 and R films have a lot of alcohol, including like Inglorious Bastards way up here at like over 600, which made me think like, man, I do not remember there being that much alcohol in that film. Um, Again, it's hard to, it can hide in plain sight, right? Like we don't need to play it backwards. Now, when we consider where do these films rank in the Australian classification scheme, and Australia is way more lenient, right? G films have a lot more alcohol, significantly more alcohol than the US films. PG films as well have way more. So, like in G films, like an average Australian G film will have an additional 5 alcohol references, and a PG film will have an additional 20. When we consider like the proportion of films, which I think is more important for G films, because you do have like a large number that don't necessarily have any here. So let's have a look at the percentages. Like 25% of USG films have alcohol use compared to 39% of Australian films, right? And when it's PG, again, like Australian films are more likely to have alcohol. And so we looked at this, like there are 43 films that both the US and Australia rank as G in our data set. And there are 43 films that the US ranks as G and the US ranks as PG and Australia ranks as G. And those have a lot more alcohol. So I'm not suggesting the US system is one that we should aspire to, but at the moment, alcohol does not appear to be a factor as much as it is maybe in other countries. And so something potentially for us to look into, and we're working on a paper about at the moment. So it's something that we're getting our head around and trying to better communicate. So apologies if I didn't do a great job of explaining that, but the hope is that maybe classifications in the future could consider this, particularly things like product placement. Now, the other thing we can do that we've been looking at is policy change is really hard and it takes a long time to push for. But what can we do to, say, support interventions or prevention efforts? And one thing we've been working on is a browser plugin. And so essentially what this browser plugin would do is you would add it to your toolbar, your search bar up here, and it would just block alcohol-related images like this. So if you're on famousattractiveinfluencers.com, and you'll note I've, again, used the same images of me looking fantastic, because I apparently have no shame, it would block those images that include alcohol. So we ran an interview with 25 people to look at like, hey, should we do this? What do you think it should look like? And lastly, people were really receptive to this idea, suggesting that it would be great for those who are aiming to reduce their drinking because it can be confronting when you see alcohol everywhere when you try to reduce the amount you're drinking, as well as for kids and young people, right? Like it's great for them to not see alcohol so much online. And so we're currently working on this. I'm getting like a deep learning model that is small enough and can run efficiently enough that just sits in that browser and will just block those alcohol references. And so, yeah, we're super, super excited about this project. And the hope is it can be used, say, as an adjunct to treatment, right? Where you offer this like, hey, like, here's this tool you can use to maybe block alcohol online if you find that helpful. The other thing we're working on is like these lists of alcohol-free films as well as alcohol-free playlists. So that, again, like if you're trying to reduce your drinking and exposure, maybe you can try listening to this type of stuff or watching these films. So that's all I think I have time for. And I've gone a little bit over because I just get far too excited. So thank you so much for listening. I'm super happy. If anyone wants to reach out about any papers or any studies we're doing, I'm happy to provide way more information. We're now on Blue Sky because we've left Twitter or X. And so if anyone wants to follow our work in our group, that's where we are. And then finally, just a huge thanks to, this is a lot of work going on here with Caper's stream of research, and huge thanks to my collaborators and also funders like thanks ARC and Vic Health and NIAAA and NIH and Fulbright. So yeah, thank you so much and appreciate it. And yeah, look forward to reading your comments and sorry for tricking you about how much alcohol is in films.
This was great. Listen, thanks again, Ben. That's amazingly complex and thorough research. It certainly reveals many insights into the power of what emerging technologies and social media, particularly, for me, that young people now have a new career aspiration. Holy, it's all new to me. Look, I don't think we've got time for. We're going to move. Any questions? I think we can get you. Got your contact details there. Look, as the last webinar of the year in this series, I'd also like to not only extend our big shout out to Ben, but to all the presenters who've helped to contribute to what has been a really rich range of topics. Also, all the folk out there who've supported the webinars through your attendance throughout 2024. At this stage, we're planning to recommence semester one will be in the 2025 calendar year, early March. The website will continue to keep you updated as we go through that. I am privy to that, and I saw some pretty good topics coming up with some pretty good presenters. So look forward to seeing you all then. Thanks again for a great year. Thanks, Ben, and we'll see you next time.